So, a few weeks ago, I gave a long talk entitled Why Defence Ought to be Defended. And it really was long. I spoke for like 5 hours solid. Uh, it was pretty intense even then. And I don't think I can do that justice in such a short format video. So perhaps I'll break it up. But today, I'm going to do my best to give the general gist of the conclusion that I've come to. Now, the overall point here is simple. I would say that defence, and nearly all aspects thereof, are fundamentally beneficial, noble, and principled. And it's an important conclusion to come to. The devotion of time, of money, of livelihood, of purpose to defence of the world is honourable and important. The dedication to a matter of such significance and such consequence is not something to be treated with disdain, or worse, frivolity, really. So to some of you, that statement's going to be a shock. I often talk to people, even people within the defence industry, who question my motives. They ask why I'm so interested in the industry in a broader context. And they're taken aback when my reasoning isn't based upon money or cool explosions, but rather based upon purpose, principle. The point is, there are so many people who believe that working and affiliating yourself with the defence industry is a compromise. That those who do it, even some people accept it, but those who do it by necessity are taking money over morality. And that it's an unfortunate reality someone has to face to feed their family. And I see this particularly with engineers who end up in the industry because there's such little choice for engineering jobs. But I don't agree with that. Today I would like to condense about a 5-hour apologia and see if I can do it in a shorter time. Because I don't see affiliating oneself with defence, in working in defence, in associating with the defence industry as a whole. I don't see it as compromise. I see it as duty and virtue. Now, the unfortunate reality is that most people who are shaking their heads right now and, banging their fists and scoffing are of my generation, of Generation Z. And that's because of a couple of things. And the first is that those who are younger have an expectation to view the world, really, whether it's biological or sociological, I don't know, but they have an expectation to view the world through a more morally idealistic lens. And that's not such a bad thing. But that moral lens is generally based upon the intensification of the status quo. This is nothing new. Younger generations take the current ethic and then take it a step further. It's not original thought. You never see someone of Gen Z trying to be more moral through the manipulation of society's ethics to match more that of Kant. It's a very specific undertaking for those of my generation. And because a large proportion of the status quo accept the zeitgeist of the time, of our time, which is that defence is inherently bad, and that's not even up for debate, my generation further intensify that and argue more against the industry. So that's one reason, but secondarily, I don't think that it's just a phase. The classical pattern that we see, that we've seen forever, of the youth basically going and intensifying the ethic of the time, I don't think it's the same thing that we're seeing now. Because over the past 20 years or so, there has generally been anti-defence sentiment. Largely over people's disagreement with the goings-on in the Middle East over the past 20 years. And I think that within our lifetime, within our parents' lifetime, we haven't really seen anyone looking to do us any real harm, any identifiable group that then hasn't been, distracted from through controversy of our own actions. We've never really had to face the consequences of evil within the world. And there are very few people within Britain today who can really conceptualize the evil of war, evil that exists. And I'm not in that category yet. I don't have a proper conception either. Now, the overall point is that people in a wider context, not just my generation, but particularly my generation, consider this sort of opinion, that detraction from defence is to be a given, that it's not even up for debate, that it's not something that we should even consider, it's a fact of life. Well, I don't think that's true. So we have to identify what these people hate. What specifically is it that they find awful about the industry? What do they treat with such a visceral reaction? What do they despise? And that's a really difficult question, but I find it quite ironic that these people will call all war, all defense evil, and yet still respect our soldiers. Which of course I do, because I think that's important, because I respect defense in general. But I would ask, if the blame doesn't fall with soldiers who take the action, then with whom does the blame lie? And it's rather indiscernible blame. It really is. So, is it with soldiers? And actually, I've seen more people of my generation really wrongly, it's a travesty, criticising the concept of soldiering entirely. So again, who's at fault? Is it the government? Is it society as a whole? Is it power-hungry agitators? Is it defence firms? Is it modernity in general? There is no key person attributable for war as a concept, certainly in the eyes of detractors. They don't identify anyone specific, they just follow the status quo. Now the point here is that there is no key person for us to pin it down to. They may disagree with the government, they may agree with the government, they may see defence firms as the arbiter of military power. This idea of mixing the military and the corporate to make a villain that I've talked about in other videos. But it's simply not true. You need someone to be able to pin down for it, and often the blame is put on the defence industry. And I think that's wrong. So, do they dislike the industry because the taxpayer's footing the bill? And generally no, because while that isn't a valid argument anyway, because far more is spent in a far looser manner on other stuff than defence, their argument isn't economic, it's moral. And that's of course important, and we should look at it from a moral perspective, but they're simply approaching it from a state of not seeing this as any form of debate, anything that should be questioned, that defence firms are perhaps good. Now, do they perhaps associate defence firms with innocent people getting hurt? And sometimes that does happen in war. They blame the defence industry. But yet this industry is very constantly working in order to increase the precision, the communication, ISR, to reduce the loss of civilians, to reduce collateral damage. And what about the innocent lives saved with these systems, with these logistics? That question never really registers, because it's seen as something that one believes by necessity, that these firms, that the idea of any sort of war is bad, when actually fighting evil is a good thing. The good that these products do, the good that these services do, is huge. It really is. It saves lives. And even within the military itself, the military needs certain things to function well, and defence firms provide those things. They provide the ability to carry out moral action. Now, in any case, I do see defence as needing to be defended. And I think it's important, because in recent years there has been a real shift in sentiment, as I've talked about. There have always been people who despise the defence firms. Perhaps not so many as today, but there have been more people today who start out with the baseline opinion. An opinion that many people are brought up with. And that sort of perpetuates the status quo and claims that defence firms do evil things, and that any affiliation is really a form of compromise. Now, I have never lived in a world where this hasn't been the case, where holding this opinion hasn't been the case. But nonetheless, I don't think that's a reason not to consider the position. The industry itself doesn't, in my view, defend its principles well enough either, because as this sentiment has grown, they are of the opinion that defence of their own position would be such controversy that they just merely don't bother. They just describe systems and their effect, which is obviously incredible. But they rarely publicly go into the meaning behind it all, the profundity. Now, it's put forward as a necessity rather than a good. But I don't think it should be. It should be put forward as a good. Now again, many people are watching this and considering it controversial, and many will claim that this sort of thought is too black and white. But I would argue that it's founded in principle, and we need that principle to function, and such principle is a reflection of admittedly more complex worldly truth. It is noble to defend a nation, and to combat evil in this world, because evil does exist, and combating it is moral. So I'll go into this more at a later date. But at least at the moment, the systems being developed, the systems that have been developed for the past 70 years, have a few core aims in mind. And the more notable one is being more precise so as to be tactically better, but also to reduce collateral damage, to increase range, to keep our people out of harm's way, to act as deterrents, because they are such exquisite systems that no nation would deign to mess with such capable forces, bolstered by logistical power. In my view, defence, as I've said, is noble. Now, people are going to say, well, sure, national defence, but that isn't something that is necessarily up for debate as much. National defence will always be necessary, and they see it as a necessary evil, but I see it as a good. But nonetheless, they'll say, what about selling arms to the Middle East? What about that? Well, I would say primarily it is a controversial topic, and one which I still debate whether I'm in agreement with. But more importantly, and there are, good arguments on either side for that, you're ignoring the majority of the industry. Those that sell domestically, that provide great service, that export to our allies, maintain a safe world through creating a strong, united force. These people do not sell to, the Star Wars empire. They largely sell to allies, nearly entirely. Actually, I think entirely. Now, there are arguments for and against selling to the Middle East, for example, and I'll go over those at some point, but nonetheless, there needn't be such disdain. Military firms sell systems, yes, but they also sell logistics, training, infrastructure for improving other nations. It's not just weapons. And the viewing of it in that manner is so incredibly short-sighted by detractors. And so to these people, who would be full detractors of the defence industry, I'd have a few questions. And those are, who's going to make the submarines that we need? Would it be you? Do you have that capability? Should we have stopped developing military technology after World War II? War which I've never heard anyone claim was unjust in foundation. Shall we halt progress then, with weapon systems that lacked precision? That lacked precision that we have today, that meant we had to drop, tens of bombs to hit a target, whereas today we can use a singular missile. Should we stop developing our systems today, so that they lack the precision that we will have tomorrow? Shall we ignore progress and the movement of defence into a more electronically based arena? An arena where violence is perhaps less necessary, the thing that you claim to want. Just a few things to consider, but anyway, to try to be succinct, which I very rarely am, national defence is virtuous. The development of technology for that purpose, and to lessen the negatives of that technology is also virtuous. To advance human technological capability is virtuous. To benefit our allies is virtuous. Defending the innocent and our correct values is also virtuous. And managing to pull off these impossible tasks of organisation, funding this, creating all of this is virtuous. And in all of this virtue, there is virtue in being steadfast when faced with those who disagree. In having the fibre to stand up and actually, and it sounds cliche, to actually claim that it is a good that's being done. Now, if we are to consider grounding in morality to be essential to living properly, which young people, including myself, seem to do, which many people in society seem to do, then perhaps consider that defence is good and right. The defence industry is good and right. And perhaps it's something that's worth your own defence. I'll leave it there.